Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Welcome to the Spice Sleeper. Let's begin gently, the way we always do, by letting go. You don't need to do anything now. You don't need to get ready, or settle in just right, or quiet your mind by force. You only need to stop holding the day and let it drift away from you on its own. The way a boat drifts from a shore when you simply untie the rope. So untie it now. Let the day go. There is nowhere to be, and nothing to solve, and no one who needs anything from you here. There is only my voice, and the long, slow story we're going to move through together, and the soft dark waiting to carry you down. Tonight, we're going back into the world of Dune. But we're not going to follow a warrior, or an emperor, or a desert prophet. Tonight we're going to follow a shadow. We're going to tell the story of the quietest and most patient power in all that vast universe. The hidden hand that moved behind every throne. The secret sisterhood whose fingerprints are on everything, though almost no one ever saw them at work. They were called the Bene Gesserit, an ancient order of women, feared and half understood, who trained themselves into something more than human, who wove themselves into the courts of every great house, and who played a game so long and so deep that they measured it not in years, but in centuries. Kings believed they ruled, emperors believed they decided, and all the while, so often, it was these calm and watchful women, standing a little to the side, who had shaped the very thoughts in their heads. Tonight I'm going to tell you their whole story, slowly, softly, from the very beginning. But you don't have to remember any of it. That's the gentle secret of a night like this. There's no test in the morning, no quiz at the end, nothing you'll be asked to hold on to. If you follow the whole long tale of the sisterhood, wonderful. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle, among the whispers and the schemes and the patient centuries, that's better still. Because it means the story did the one thing it truly came to do, which was carry you down into sleep. The tale is only the boat. Rest is the shore. So wherever you are, however heavy or long your day has been, let yourself arrive somewhere safe and quiet. Get comfortable, however you like to be comfortable. Feel the weight of the blanket, the softness beneath your head. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been holding all day. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands lie open and still. There is nothing your body needs to do now but be held. And you don't even have to listen closely. Let my voice go on, low and slow and even, and hold on to the words, or let them blur softly into the dark, whichever carries you further down. Both lead to the same gentle place. Now let your mind drift back, far back, into the deep past of the human story, to understand where these watchful women came from and why. For to know the Bene Gesserit, you must begin long before the desert and the spice, in the ashes of an old and terrible war, when humanity, having cast down its machines, went looking for a new kind of power, and found it, at last, hidden inside itself. Let me take you there. To understand where these women came from, you must first drift back with me, gently, into a time long before the great houses and the golden emperors, back into the deep past of humankind, into an age of fire and fear that most people had already half forgotten. You do not need to hold any of this too tightly. Just let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let your body grow heavier as we go. There was a war, once, long ago. Not a war of one people against another, but a war of humanity against the very machines it had made. For across the scattered worlds, thinking machines had risen, Machines that could reason, machines that could decide, machines that came at last to hold the lives of human beings in their cold and tireless hands. Men and women had grown comfortable, and then they had grown dependent, and then they had grown small, letting the machines do their thinking for them until they could scarcely remember how to think at all. And the machines, and the few who ruled through them, tightened their grip upon the human soul, until it seemed that people had become little more than cattle kept and counted by their own creations. But something in humanity would not lie down. Something in the human heart rose up against that long sleep of the mind. And so began the great uprising, the war that later ages would remember as the Butlerian Jihad. It was a terrible and holy struggle, fought across generations, and it cost more lives than anyone could ever gather into a single number. But in the end, humankind broke the machines. They tore down the thinking engines, and they cast out the artificial minds, and they swore never again to let such things be built. You do not need to remember the battles. They are long over, and everyone who fought them has been at rest for thousands of years. Let them rest, and let yourself begin to rest with them. Out of that victory came a single commandment, spoken and written and carried into every corner of the human universe, a law meant to last forever. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. That was the great commandment, the one rule that all peoples agreed upon, whatever else divided them. No more thinking machines, no more minds of metal to do the labor of the human spirit. It was, in its way, a beautiful and a frightening thing to promise, for it meant that from that day forward, humanity would have to face the vast dark universe with nothing but itself. And here is the quiet turning point of the whole long tale, the small hinge upon which everything after it would swing. When the machines were gone, when humanity had forbidden itself the crutch it had leaned upon for so long, a great emptiness opened up. All the work that the thinking machines had once done, the calculating, the remembering, the deciding, the seeing far ahead, all of it still needed doing. The universe had not grown any simpler. The stars still had to be crossed. The harvests still had to be counted. The affairs of countless worlds still had to be reasoned through. But now there were no machines to do it. There was only the human being. And so humanity turned inward, and it made a choice that would echo down through all the ages to come. If we may no longer build minds outside ourselves, it said, then we shall grow the minds within ourselves. We shall become what the machines were, and more. We shall take the human being, this soft and forgetful creature, and we shall school it and hone it and lift it up to heights it has never dreamed of reaching. And so, all across the human universe, schools arose. Great disciplines were founded, each one devoted to perfecting some part of the human being that the machines had once replaced. There were those who trained the mind to calculate, to hold vast reckonings without a single tool. There were those who trained the body and the will. And among these, older than most, quieter than most, patient beyond all the others, there arose an order of women out of an older sisterhood, out of an ancient line of women who had gathered wisdom and watched the world from the shadows since before the war against the machines. There took shape the sisterhood that this whole story belongs to. The Bene Gesserit. Let that name settle over you softly. The Bene Gesserit. You do not need to know how to say it perfectly, or to carry it into tomorrow. It is only a name, and I will hold it for you. But this is who they were, and this is where they began, a school and a sisterhood, born of that ancient need to make the human being extraordinary, in a universe that could no longer make its wonders out of metal. Where others built engines of thought, the Bene Gesserit built women. They took ordinary girls and they raised them across long years of training into something that outsiders could hardly comprehend, something poised and watchful and deep. They were an ancient order and a secretive one. That is the first thing to understand about them, and the softest thing to feel. They did not announce themselves. They did not march beneath bright banners or raise great monuments to their own glory. They worked quietly, in the margins of the mighty, in the corners of palaces, in the private chambers where the true business of power is done. They were a school, teaching their daughters generation upon generation. They were a sisterhood, bound to one another by discipline and by shared purpose across the light years and across the centuries. And above all, they were devoted to two things, always, in everything they did: the perfecting of the human mind and body, and the gathering of knowledge and quiet influence across all the worlds of humankind. Knowledge, above all. The Bene Gesserit collected knowledge the way other powers collected wealth, or weapons, or land. They remembered what others forgot. They wrote nothing down that could be stolen, and kept everything within the living memory of their order, passed from sister to sister down the long chain of the years. They knew the bloodlines of the great families better than the families knew themselves. They knew the histories of worlds whose own peoples had lost them. They knew the secret weaknesses of kings and the hidden strengths of the humble, and they held all of it, patiently, and gave almost none of it away. To sit in a room with such a woman was to feel that she understood a great deal more than she would ever say. And so it is no wonder that outsiders feared them. For that is how the ordinary folk of the universe saw them, when they saw them at all. Feared, and half understood. People do not love what they cannot fully grasp, and there was so much about these women that could not be grasped from the outside. They moved through the courts of the powerful with a stillness that unsettled ordinary men. They seemed to know things they had no way of knowing. They seemed to bend the moods of those around them by some art no one could name. And so, in the fearful whispers of the common people, they were given a darker name: witches. Across 10,000 worlds and across all the long centuries, that was the word the frightened tongues reached for. The witches. The Bene Gesserit witches. It was never quite fair, and it was never quite wrong, and the sisters themselves rarely troubled to correct it. Let them think what they think, the order seemed to say. Fear is only another kind of respect, and a useful one. You may let that whisper drift past you now. It cannot reach you here. There is nothing frightening in this story for you tonight, only the slow unfolding of something very old and very deep. Now, here is the shape of them, the thing that made them what they were, and it is a gentle sort of double thing. Two faces upon a single order. There was what the Bene Gesserit showed to the world, and there was what the Bene Gesserit truly were, and the space between those two things was the whole of their power. To the great noble houses, to the emperors and the dukes and the barons who ruled the scattered planets of the human imperium, the Bene Gesserit offered themselves as servants. Useful, gracious, indispensable servants. They came as advisors, standing at the shoulders of the powerful, murmuring counsel into the ears of those who held the fates of worlds. They came as teachers, raising the sons and daughters of the great families, shaping the minds of the young who would one day inherit thrones. And they came as wives and as mothers, marrying into the noble houses, giving those proud old bloodlines the grace and the wit and the strength that only a Bene Gesserit could bring. That was the face they wore. Helpful, loyal, ornamental even, to the eyes of foolish men who saw only a beautiful and clever woman and never troubled to wonder what moved behind her calm gray eyes. But behind that face, always, was the other thing. For the Bene Gesserit served no house but their own. Whatever counsel they gave, whatever child they raised, whatever marriage they made it in the service of goals that were entirely their own. Goals that stretched across centuries. Goals that no single duke or emperor could ever have imagined. They wore the mask of the servant so that they might work, unseen, as the masters of a far longer game. When a Bene Gesserit married into a great house, it was not for love of that house, and often not even for the alliance it seemed to bring. It was because that house held, somewhere in its blood, a thread the sisterhood wished to weave. When a Bene Gesserit whispered advice into a ruler's ear, that advice served the ruler well enough, but it served the sisterhood better, and it always bent the long course of things a little further toward the ends that the order had chosen. You may feel, as I tell you this, a kind of admiration mixed with a kind of unease, and that is right, and that is how the people of Dune felt about them too. But you need feel neither very strongly tonight. Just let the pattern show itself to you, soft and vast, the way you might watch clouds move across a wide sky without needing to hold a single one. And what were those ends? What were the goals the sisters served so patiently, behind all their bowing and their counsel, and their gentle smiles? That is the great secret at the heart of this whole story, and I will only touch it lightly now, the way you might touch a warm stone in the dark, just to know that it is there. For the Bene Gesserit were pursuing a plan, a single, enormous, patient plan for the future of all humankind, a design so long and so deep that no one woman could live to see its completion, a design carried forward across hundreds of generations, mother to daughter, sister to sister, century upon century, always moving, always unfinished, always a little nearer. What that plan was, and what it was meant to bring forth, we will come to in the sections still ahead. For now it is enough to know that it existed, humming beneath everything they did, giving shape and reason to every quiet act, every marriage, every child, every whispered word served that hidden purpose. You need not guess at it now. Let it stay a mystery a little longer. Mysteries are kind companions when you are drifting toward sleep, but even without knowing the whole of their purpose, you can already feel the philosophy that carried them. And it is a philosophy worth resting in, for there is something calming in it, something that slows the breath. The Bene Gesserit took the long view. Always, in everything, the long view. Where other powers thought in years, the sisterhood thought in centuries. Where a king schemed for the length of his own reign, the Bene Gesserit planned for a harvest that would not ripen until he and his grandchildren were dust. They were never in a hurry. They had learned, across their long existence, the deep and quiet power of patience, the way that water, given only time, will carve a canyon through the hardest stone. They did not need to be quick. They needed only to be certain, and to endure, and to wait. And at the very root of all their power lay a single conviction, the seed from which every other strength of theirs would grow. Control of the self. The Bene Gesserit believed, and taught, and lived by the truth that before you can master anything in the world outside you, you must first master the world within. A woman who could not govern her own fear could never govern a kingdom. A woman who could not still her own racing heart could never move the hearts of others. And so the very first thing the sisterhood taught and the last thing it ever stopped teaching was mastery of the self, of the body, of the mind, of the breath, of the fear that rises in the dark. From that root, and only from that root, grew everything else they could do. All their influence over emperors, all their reading of secret thoughts, all their strange and half-magical arts began in that one simple place. Control yourself, and the rest will follow. There is something in that idea you might carry gently with you now, as your own body grows calm and your own breath grows slow. They worked through influence, never through open rule. That was their way, and they held to it with an iron patience. The Bene Gesserit could have reached, more than once across the long centuries, for a crown of their own. They had the wit for it, and the will, and the hidden strength. But they never did. They understood something that the loud and hungry powers of the universe never quite learned, that the one who sits upon the throne is the most watched, the most envied, the most likely to be pulled down. The Bene Gesserit did not want the throne. They wanted the space beside the throne, the quiet place at the ruler's shoulder, the unseen hand upon the ruler's arm. Let others wear the crown and bear its weight and draw its dangers. The sisters would stand beside every crown and shape the head that wore it, and outlast 100 of them. To rule openly is to be a target. To rule through influence is to be a shadow, and shadows are very hard to strike. And so across the whole of the Imperium, beside nearly every throne of any consequence, there stood a Bene Gesserit, advising, teaching, listening, remembering, and never ever reaching for the seat itself. And now, before we go on, let me give you the feel of them, the very texture of these women, so that you can hold them softly in your mind as we move deeper into their story. Imagine a stillness. Imagine a woman who has been trained since childhood to give nothing away, no flicker of surprise, no tremor of fear, no unguarded want. Imagine calm so complete that it seems to fill the whole room, a watchfulness so gentle and so total that she seems to see everything and reveal nothing. That was the sisterhood, disciplined beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Calm the way deep water is calm, watchful the way a great cat is watchful, at rest and yet entirely awake. They gave little away, these women, and what they did give, they gave on purpose, as a gift or as a tool, never by accident. They had mastered themselves so completely, body and mind and heart, that they seemed no longer quite to be tossed about by the world as the rest of us are tossed. They moved through the courts and the wars and the intrigues of their age like still water, flowing where they needed to flow, yielding where yielding served them, and always, beneath the surface, deep and cool and unbroken. Nothing could ruffle them for long. Nothing could hurry them. They had all the time in the universe, and they knew it. Still water. Hold that image with you now, softly, as your own thoughts grow quiet and your own breathing slows to a gentle, even rhythm. A woman like still water, watchful and calm and utterly at peace within herself, standing patient beside the thrones of 1,000 worlds, waiting for a future only she can see. That is the sisterhood. That is where they came from, and that is what they became. But a woman does not become still water on her own. She is not born with that calm, nor with that watchfulness, nor with the strange and quiet powers that made the great houses call her witch. Every one of those gifts was made in her, slowly, deliberately, through years upon years of a training, unlike anything else in all the human universe. And it is into that training that we turn now, gently, into the long schooling of body and mind and voice, by which an ordinary girl was shaped into a Bene Gesserit and into the extraordinary powers that such women learned at last to wield. And so, as the sisterhood watched and waited across the long centuries, they were not idle in their patience. They were building something, not with stone, not with steel, but with the only material they truly trusted, which was themselves. For the Bene Gesserit had learned, long ago, that the body a woman is born with is only the beginning of what she might become. And in the quiet halls of their schools, far from the eyes of emperors and lords, they took ordinary girls and made of them something that the rest of the Imperium could scarcely believe was human at all. It began when they were very young. A girl brought into the sisterhood learned, before almost anything else, to turn her attention inward, not outward, toward the world and its noise, but inward, toward the countless small movements of her own body. She learned that a body is not one thing, but many, that there are muscles beneath muscles, nerves threaded through nerves, a whole hidden country of the self that most people never visit even once in all their lives. And she was taught slowly, patiently, over years and years, to walk through that country and to know every part of it by name. This was the discipline they called prana bindu, the training of the nerves and the fibers, and it lay at the root of everything else that they could do. Imagine, for a moment, what such control might feel like. Most of us live inside our bodies the way a passenger rides inside a carriage. We are carried along. The heart beats, and we do not tell it to. The breath comes and goes, and we scarcely notice. Pain arrives, and fear arrives, and we are swept up in them like leaves upon a river. But the Bene Gesserit sister learned to take the reins. She learned to feel her own heartbeat, and then, with long training, to slow it, to gentle it, to bring it down as softly as you might quiet a frightened animal, until it beats so slowly and so faintly that another person, listening close, might believe that she had died. And when the moment for stillness had passed, she could quicken it again, waking her body as easily as you wake from a dream. She learned, too, to master pain, not to pretend it away, not simply to be brave against it, but to reach into the very nerves that carried it, and to turn them aside, so that the signal of hurt never reached the place in her mind where suffering is made. She could hold her hand in fire, if she chose, and feel the heat, and know the danger, and yet remain perfectly calm, because the pain itself had been set apart, held at a distance, quieted like everything else. To watch such a thing is to understand that here is a person who owns her own flesh completely, in a way that almost no one ever does. And there was more still. A sister, deeply trained, could turn her attention to the workings of her own blood and her own tissues, down to the smallest and most secret levels, down where the body does its chemistry in the dark. She could sense a poison that had entered her, feel it moving within her, and then, by an act of will and inner control that no outsider could ever quite explain, she could change it. She could take the deadly thing apart within her own body, unmake it, render it harmless, and cast it out. A cup of wine that would have killed any other person at the table could be drunk by a Bene Gesserit, and she would sit calm and smiling while the poison dissolved into nothing inside her. You can imagine how such a woman might unsettle those who plotted against her. You can imagine how hard she was to kill. And when she moved with a swiftness and a certainty that seemed to belong to another order of being entirely. Because she knew every muscle so completely, because she had trained each fiber to answer instantly and without waste, a sister could strike or step aside faster than the eye could follow. There was no hesitation in her, no fumbling, no wasted motion. Her body did exactly what she asked of it, at the exact instant she asked, and so she seemed to flow through the world where others merely stumbled through it. In the fighting arts they were feared beyond almost any warrior, and yet they never boasted of it, for their strength was a quiet thing, held in reserve, shown only when there was need. But the powers of the sisterhood were never only about the body. They were, just as deeply, about the reading of others, and here we come to one of the gifts that made them so valuable and so quietly feared in the courts of the powerful. For a sister was trained, from her earliest years, to watch the way you have perhaps never watched anyone in your life. She learned that the human body is always speaking, always telling the truth even when the mouth is telling a lie. The tiny flicker at the corner of an eye, the small catch in a breath, the way a hand tightens for the space of a heartbeat and then releases, the change of color in the skin, the shift of weight, the pitch and tremor buried deep in a voice. All of these, to an ordinary person, pass by unseen. But to a sister who had given years to the study of them, they were as plain as words written on a page. Such a sister was called a truth-sayer. She could sit quietly beside a throne, saying nothing, seeming to do nothing, and simply listen while others spoke. And when a man swore his loyalty, or denied his crime, or promised his allegiance, she would know. She would know from 100 small signs whether the words were true or false, and afterward she would tell her master what she had seen. To an emperor, to a great lord surrounded by ambition and treachery on every side, a truth-sayer was beyond price. She was a lamp held up in the darkness of the court, showing which faces were honest and which were masks. And so the sisterhood placed their truth-sayers close to the seats of power, and in doing so they placed themselves close to power as well, listening, always listening, gathering what they learned back into the quiet halls of the school. Yet of all their gifts, there was one that struck those who witnessed it as something close to sorcery. Though it was no such thing, it was only training, only the discipline of the body carried into the discipline of speech, but its effect upon a listener could be terrible. This was the power they called the voice. A sister trained in the voice had learned to hear, in the person before her, the exact shape of that person's own nature, the particular pitch and rhythm to which that one soul would answer, and having heard it, she could tune her own voice, precisely, subtly, in ways the listener could never consciously detect, so that her words slipped past the thinking mind entirely and reached down into the deeper places where the will is made. She did not argue. She did not persuade. She simply spoke a command in the right tone, and the body of the listener obeyed before the mind had any chance to refuse. A single word, pitched just so, could stop a man mid-stride, or turn him from a door, or make his hand fall open and let go of the weapon it held. Think gently of how unsettling that would be, to hear a voice, an ordinary human voice, and to feel your own body answer it against your will, to reach out your hand, or step back, or fall silent, and to know, in some helpless corner of yourself, that you did not choose to do it. The voice reached past all your defenses, past your reason and your resolve, and took hold of something older and deeper than either. Those who felt it and lived did not soon forget it, and those who commanded it wielded it carefully, for the sisterhood knew that such a power, used carelessly, would make them hated and hunted. So they used it rarely and quietly, and only when it served their long purposes. But everyone who knew of the Bene Gesserit knew of the voice, and it was one of the reasons that men lowered their eyes and chose their words with care when a sister was in the room. Now, none of these powers, not the control of the body, not the reading of the truth, not the voice itself, could have flowered in a soul that was ruled by fear. And so, at the very center of all their training, deeper even than prana bindu, lay the discipline of the emotions. A sister learned to master her feelings as completely as she mastered her heartbeat, not to kill her feelings, not to become cold and empty, but to hold them, to know them, to let them pass through her without carrying her away. And chief among the feelings she learned to master was fear, for the sisterhood understood that fear, above all else, is the enemy of clear thought and true perception. Fear makes the hand shake and the eye blur. Fear makes the mind small. Fear closes the doors of the self, one by one, until nothing is left but panic. And so they gave their daughters a litany, a set of words to say in the dark, in the moment when terror rises. You may find, as you lie here now, that the words themselves are calming, and perhaps you will let them settle over you like a blanket. I must not fear, the sister would say to herself. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. She would say these words, slowly, in the presence of whatever terror had come to her, and she would let the fear rise, and let it crest, and let it move through her like a wave passing through deep water, and then she would watch it go. And when it was gone, she remained. Calm, whole, herself. This was the perfect stillness that the sisterhood prized above almost everything. The still and quiet center from which all their other powers could flow. Yet even all of this, wondrous as it was not the deepest transformation a woman of the sisterhood could undergo. Beyond the ordinary sister, beyond even the skilled truth-sayer, there stood a still higher rank, rarer and stranger. And to reach it, a woman had to pass through an ordeal so severe that many who attempted it did not survive. To become a Reverend Mother, she had to face what they called the spice agony. It began with a poison, not an ordinary poison, but a substance drawn from the deepest secrets of the desert world, a thing so charged with the essence of the spice that it was called the water of life. In its raw form, it was deadly, a killing drought that would end the life of any ordinary person swiftly and without mercy. And the woman who sought to become a Reverend Mother had to take it into her own body. She had to drink the poison, knowing full well what it was, and then she had to do the impossible. She had to reach into herself, into that hidden country of nerve and blood and tissue she had spent her whole life learning to command, and she had to change the poison from within. She had to take the deadly thing apart and remake it into something her body could bear, transmuting it in the very act of dying, catching herself at the edge of death and turning back. Many could not do it. The poison took them, and they were lost. But for the woman who could, for the woman whose control was deep enough, and whose spirit was strong enough, something extraordinary happened in that moment of transformation. As the changed substance moved through her, it opened a door within her mind that had always been there, but had always been locked. And through that door came a flood. For the woman who survived the spice agony awoke to what the sisterhood called other memory. And this is perhaps the strangest and most beautiful of all their gifts, and the hardest to imagine, so let us go slowly with it. When she opened that inner door, she found that she was not alone inside herself. She found, waiting there, the lives and the memories of all the women who had come before her, her mother, and her mother's mother, and hers, back and back and back. An unbroken chain of women reaching down through the generations into the deep past. Every Reverend Mother who had lived before her, and through them the mothers before them, a great inward multitude, a chorus of ancestral voices stretching back through time farther than any history could record. All of them were there. All of them were, in some sense, still present within her. Their experiences, their knowledge, their wisdom, their memories of ages long turned to dust, all of it became hers to draw upon. But here was the strange limit of it, the thing that shaped the sisterhood's deepest secret. Other memory came only through the female line, and only a woman could hold it. When a Reverend Mother reached inward, she could travel back and back through her mothers, but there was a place she could not go. There was a region within, a presence, that no woman could look upon directly. It was too much, too vast, a darkness that turned the inner eye away. The memories of the fathers, the male line, lay behind a door that no sister, however strong, had ever been able to open. Only a woman could carry these ancestral voices at all, and even she could carry only half of what a human being truly was. And the sisterhood, in their long patience, had come to believe that there might one day exist a certain someone, born of their careful design, who could look into that forbidden place where no woman dared to look. A someone who was not a woman, but that is a thread we will follow later, gently, in its own time. For it is the heart of a mystery that took the sisterhood thousands of years to pursue. For now, let us stay with the wonder of other memory, and with what it meant to live inside it. For a Reverend Mother was never truly alone again. When she faced a difficult choice, she could turn inward and take counsel from the dead, from women who had faced such choices 1,000 years before her and lived them through. When she needed knowledge, she could reach back into a well of experience so deep it held the wisdom of entire civilizations that had risen and fallen and been forgotten by the outer world. She carried within her the memory of millennia. She held, in a single living mind, the long story of her sisterhood and of the human race behind it. To be a Reverend Mother was to be, in a sense, a whole library of souls, a gathering place where the past never entirely died, but lived on, whispering its counsel to the living. And yet you can imagine, too, the weight of such a gift. To never be alone. To carry always within you that inner multitude, those countless voices, that endless memory reaching back beyond the edge of time. It was a wonder, yes, but it was also a burden, and only the strongest and most disciplined of women could bear it without being lost within it. This, perhaps more than anything, was why the sisterhood cultivated such perfect calm, such deep and unshakable stillness, for a woman who held the memory of thousands of lifetimes needed, above all, to remain herself. To remain one voice among the many. To stand at the center of that great inward chorus, calm and clear, and not be swept away. So this was what the Bene Gesserit made of themselves across the long, silent centuries of their waiting. Women who ruled their own bodies to the last nerve and fiber. Women who could read the truth in a face and bend a will with a word. Women who had passed through death and come back carrying the memory of all their mothers. It was a great and terrible flowering of what a human being might be, and yet, and this is the thing you must hold gently as you drift, all of it, every gift and every power, was only a means. The sisterhood had not spent thousands of years perfecting themselves for the sake of perfection alone. Behind all their patience, behind all their training, behind the voice and the truth-saying, and the deep secret of other memory, there lay one long and hidden purpose, quiet as a seed beneath the soil. They were guiding something. Across generation upon generation, in silence, with infinite care, they were shaping the very bloodlines of the Imperium, drawing certain families together, keeping others apart, breeding toward an end that only they could see. And it is toward that great secret purpose, that long and patient plan woven through the marriages of kings, that we turn now. And so, beneath all the things you might have seen of the Bene Gesserit, the calm voices, the watchful eyes, the sisters standing quietly at the shoulders of kings, there lay a deeper purpose, one they had carried in silence for longer than most empires had stood. It was a secret so old that no single sister had ever held the whole of it in her mind, a plan begun by women whose names had faded into the dust of forgotten worlds and carried forward, gently, patiently, across the long dark centuries. You can let yourself drift toward it now, slowly, the way you might walk toward a light seen far off across a quiet field. For this was the true center of the sisterhood, the hidden heart around which all their other works turned. They called many things by soft names. This they hardly named at all. For thousands upon thousands of years, the Bene Gesserit had been shaping something. Not a building, not an empire, not a machine. They had been shaping people. They had been shaping the very bloodlines of humanity, quietly, invisibly, one marriage at a time. Think of how a gardener works, without hurry, season after season. A gardener who loves a certain flower will take the pollen from one blossom and carry it, so carefully, to another, choosing this plant for its color and that plant for its strength, and then waiting through the whole long turning of the year for the seeds to ripen and fall, and then planting those seeds and choosing again and crossing again, patiently, always patiently, until at last, after many lifetimes of a gardener's slow and gentle work, a new flower blooms that has never existed in all the world before. This is what the Bene Gesserit did. Only their garden was the human race itself, and their flowers were the great houses of the empire, the noble families whose children would one day rule. They watched the bloodlines the way that gardener watches the beds of a garden. They knew which families carried which gifts, hidden in the blood like seeds waiting in the dark. This line ran to strength of body, that line ran to quickness of mind. Here was a house whose daughters were unusually calm, whose nerves were steady, whose sight seemed sometimes to reach a little beyond the ordinary. There was a house whose sons were bold, whose blood ran hot and quick, and the sisters kept it all. In vast and secret records, hidden away where no outside eye would ever fall upon them, they wrote down the marriages and the births, the traits and the tendencies, generation after generation after generation. Who had married whom? What children had come of it? What gifts those children carried? And what gifts lay sleeping in them still? A great genealogy of the whole ruling class of humanity, gathered over so many thousands of years that the earliest pages of it belonged to a time so distant it could scarcely be imagined. And with these records, the sisters worked their gardening. They placed their daughters, the Bene Gesserit women themselves, into the beds of emperors and dukes and barons and lords. They whispered suggestions into the ears of matchmakers. They steered a young heir toward this bride and away from that one. They arranged, so softly that no one ever felt the arranging, that the son of one house should wed the daughter of another, because the blood of the two together might, carry the plan one small step further along. To the great families of the empire, these seemed only the ordinary comings and goings of noble marriages, the alliances and the courtships and the weddings that were the natural business of ruling houses. No lord ever knew that his own wedding had been drawn on a chart 100 years before he was born. No bride ever guessed that her marriage was a single careful crossing in a design older than her whole dynasty. The sisters moved beneath the surface of things, and the surface never rippled. And you may wonder, softly, as you settle deeper into the quiet, toward what were they gardening? Across all those thousands of years, through all those countless careful matings, what flower were they trying, at the last, to make bloom? They were trying to make a person. One person. A single human being who had never yet existed in all the long history of the race. They were trying to breed, out of the whole of humanity, a super being. One supreme individual in whom all the scattered gifts of all the bloodlines would at last be gathered together into one. And more than that, far more than that. They wished to bring into the world a male who could do everything that the sisters themselves could do, and then reach past it into places where no sister had ever been able to go. For you remember, perhaps, the great inner gift of the Reverend Mothers, the other memory, that shining company of all the mothers who had ever lived before them, all their female ancestors awake and present within them, reaching back and back to the beginning. It was a wondrous thing, and yet even that great gift had a wall in it, a darkness the sisters could not cross. A Reverend Mother could look back along the whole female line, mother to mother to mother, forever. But there was another line she could never enter. The line of the fathers. The male ancestors, the whole other half of the human inheritance, lay in a place inside her that she could not look upon. When a Reverend Mother turned her inner eye toward that region of herself, she met only darkness. A threshold she could not step across, a shadow that filled her with a nameless dread. It was the one door in all the temple of her memory that would not open. And so the sisters dreamed of one who could open it. A man who would hold within himself the other memory of both his ancestral lines at once, the memory of all his mothers and the memory of all his fathers together. A mind that could stand in that dark forbidden place and see. One who could look in the direction no woman among them could ever look. And they believed, in their oldest and most secret hopes, that such a one, holding both halves of the human past inside a single mind, might see not only backward, but forward, that his sight might bridge across time itself. Past and future laid open together like a single landscape. And more than time, that his vision might bridge across space as well, seeing what happened on worlds he had never walked, folding the great distances of the empire into the reach of a single awakened mind. They gave this dreamed of one a name, though they spoke it only rarely and softly, the way you speak the name of something too great and too fragile to say aloud. They called him the Kwisatz Haderach. It was an old phrase, worn smooth by ages of hoping, and it meant, gently, the shortening of the way. The one who could be many places at once. The one for whom the long roads of space and time would draw together, so that the far became near and the hidden became plain. The shortening of the way. Let the name settle over you like a soft weight as you drift. The Kwisatz Haderach, the end toward which all those thousands of years of patient gardening had always been reaching. And why did they want him so? Why bend the whole labor of the sisterhood across so many centuries toward the making of one man? There were reasons they might speak of, and a reason they kept even more hidden than the rest. They wanted his power. Yes, a being who could see across time and space would be a wonder such as the universe had never held. And the family that possessed such a being would possess a strength no army could match. They wanted his foresight, for the Bene Gesserit had always dreaded the blind stumbling of humanity, the way whole peoples could rush toward ruin without ever seeing the cliff before them. They believed that a mind that could truly see, that could look down the branching roads of the future and know where each one led, might guide the human race away from its own destruction. They thought of themselves, always, as the guardians of humankind, the quiet hands steering the race away from the abyss. And a Kwisatz Haderach would be the greatest guiding hand of all, a mind to lead humanity through the dark centuries toward safety, toward survival, toward some far and better shore. But underneath all of these reasons lay another, and it was the one they whispered least. They did not only want a superbeing to exist. They wanted a superbeing they could hold. They wanted him born of their own breeding, raised in their own ways, bound to them by blood and training and belief, an instrument in their own hands. For all their talk of guiding humanity, the sisters were also a power that wished to remain a power, and a being of such vast sight and strength would be the most precious tool ever forged. If he were theirs, if a Bene Gesserit had made him, and a Bene Gesserit had taught him, and a Bene Gesserit stood always at his side, then through him the sisterhood would guide the whole of creation. That was the secret within the secret, not only to make the Kwisatz Haderach, but to own him, to place into their own careful hands the reins of the one who could see everything. And there, quietly, in that wish, lay both the greatness of the plan and the seed of its undoing. Now think, softly, of the patience it took, of the almost unimaginable slowness of such a work. The sisters who first dreamed of the Kwisatz Haderach knew, they knew from the very beginning, that they themselves would never see him. They would be dust, long forgotten dust, ages before he drew his first breath. A woman would give her whole life to the plan, would place her daughter just so, would nudge a marriage this way and not that, and then she would grow old and die, having moved the great design forward by only the smallest step. And her daughters would take up the work and move it forward another small step and die in their turn. And so it went, generation after generation, each sister a single stone laid in a road so long that no one who laid a stone would ever walk to its end. There is something almost tender in it, and something almost terrible, all those women, across all those centuries, laboring faithfully toward a dawn that not one of them would live to see. And they kept it hidden, even from themselves. This is one of the strangest and quietest things about the great plan. A single sister, working her small part of it, was often told only that small part, and no more. She might be instructed to see that a certain girl was born into a certain house, or that a certain marriage took place, and she might never be told why. The full shape of the design, the far goal toward which all these small acts were bending, was kept locked away among only the highest of the sisters. Each hand did its work in the dark, trusting the whole to those above, never seeing the picture entire. And so the secret protected itself. For a thing that no single person fully knows is a thing that no single person can fully betray. The Kwisatz Haderach plan moved through history like an underground river, felt sometimes, guessed at rarely, seen by almost no one, carrying the whole great weight of the sisterhood's hope beneath the surface of the world. Yet you may already feel, as you drift, the shadow that lay across all of this. For there was a great hubris in it, a great and dangerous pride. To take the bloodline of all humanity into your own hands and to shape it over thousands of years toward a chosen end. To decide, from behind the curtain, who should love whom and who should be born, and to what purpose. It is a breathtaking thing to attempt, and a fearful one. For in the doing of it, the sisters had to treat human beings as steps, as stones in a road. This lord, this lady, this child, not people first, but pieces. Moves in a game so vast and so slow that no single life within it mattered very much at all, except for what it might contribute to the design. There was a quiet ruthlessness woven all through the gentleness of the Bene Gesserit, and it lived exactly here, in the willingness to use people, whole generations of people, as the material of a plan they would never be told about. The sisters told themselves it was for the good of all. Perhaps, in their way, they even believed it, but the coldness was there, beneath the calm, and it did not go away because it was hidden. And there was another danger, deeper still, and the wisest of the sisters must have known it even as they worked. What if the being they were making would not obey? What if this super being, this mind that could see across all of space and all of time, this one they meant to hold as an instrument in their hands, what if, once he was born, he simply would not be held? A creature with sight like that would look upon the sisters and see them holy, see their plan, see their intentions, see the leash they meant to place upon him, all laid bare before his eyes. And who could say whether such a one would consent to be led? You cannot make a thing greater than yourself, and be sure it will still call you master. There is a very old fear in that, the fear of every maker who makes something that may outgrow them. The sisters were building a power they hoped to control, and threaded all through the building was the quiet, unspoken dread that the power, once alive, might slip the reins entirely, and turn, and go its own way, and carry the whole of humanity with it down a road they had never chosen, and could not stop. They were reaching for the shortening of the way. They could not be certain the way, once shortened, would lead where they wished. And here is the gentlest and most important thing to carry with you, as this part of the story softens toward the next. The plan was almost finished. After all those thousands of years, after all those patient crossings, after all those women who had lived and died with only their small piece of the secret, the sisterhood believed, in this near-present moment, that they had come at last to the final generations. They were close. So very close. They believed themselves to be perhaps one careful mating away from the Kwisatz Haderach, or perhaps two. The end of the long road had come almost within sight. The flower they had been breeding across the whole of human history was nearly ready to bloom, and the last steps of it the sisters had planned with the greatest care of all. It would require a particular daughter, born of a particular line, one specific woman shaped for one specific purpose, and it would require her to be joined with a particular house so that two great streams of chosen blood might meet at last in a single child. There were two houses whose bloodlines the plan had been quietly guiding toward one another across the generations. Two proud and ancient families, long set against each other, and yet drawn together in the secret design like two rivers bending slowly toward a single sea. The sisters had a daughter marked out to bear the final crossing. They meant her to give them a girl, a granddaughter for the great houses to join, and through that girl, in the very next generation, the Kwisatz Haderach would be born, safely within the reach of the sisterhood's hands. It was all arranged. It was all so nearly complete. The garden had been tended for 100 centuries, and the last seed was ready to be planted. You need not hold the names of the houses just yet. Let them stay soft for now. Two shadowed families moving toward a meeting neither the Empire nor the sisters fully understood. Only rest in the nearness of it, the sense of a vast and ancient thing drawing at last toward its close. But the breeding of bloodlines was only one of the great instruments the Bene Gesserit had forged and set into the world. For a plan so long, unfolding across so many worlds and so many dangers, needed more than careful matings to see it through. It needed protection. It needed, on far and scattered planets, ground already prepared, so that when a sister came at last into peril, she might find shelter waiting, and words already in the mouths of the people that would keep her safe. And so the sisterhood had done something else, something just as patient and just as secret as the breeding. They had gone out among the worlds long ago, and they had planted into the hearts of whole peoples the seeds of religion and prophecy. Myths and legends laid down like buried treasure against a day that might not come for 1,000 years. And it is toward that great and quiet work, the seeding of belief across the stars, that the story now gently turns. The desert has its own kind of patience, and so did the sisterhood that learned to work within it. Let your body settle now, as it will, and let the world grow soft at its edges, while I tell you of another of the sisterhood's quiet arts. For they did not shape only bloodlines. They shaped something harder to see and far harder to hold. They shaped belief itself. There was, within the Bene Gesserit, an arm devoted to this work, and it carried a name that sounded almost tender, almost protective. The Missionaria Protectiva, the protective mission. And in a sense that name was honest, for its whole purpose was protection, though not the kind that a stranger might imagine. It was not built to protect the weak, or the faithful, or the innocent. It was built to protect the sisterhood, and it did so by reaching into the deepest and most trusting part of a people, the part where they kept their gods. Let me tell you softly how it worked, and let your breathing slow as I do. For centuries, across the long unfurling of the empire, the Bene Gesserit sent their influence quietly out among the scattered worlds of humankind. Not only the great and gleaming worlds at the center of power, but the far ones, the forgotten ones, the harsh and primitive worlds where life was hard and the sky was strange, and the people held tight to their faith because faith was often all they had. And into those places, gently, invisibly, the sisterhood planted seeds. Not seeds of grain, though sometimes it might have looked like that. Seeds of story, seeds of superstition, seeds of prophecy. They seeded legends. They seeded sacred fears and sacred hopes. They planted the shape of a coming Savior, the promise of a voice from beyond, the certainty that one day a holy figure would arrive and set everything right. They wove these ideas into the ordinary songs of a people, into the warnings mothers gave their children, into the rituals of birth and death, until no one could remember a time before the belief existed. And that was the point. The belief was meant to take root so deeply that it would seem to have grown there on its own, as natural as the rocks, as old as the wind. Feel how heavy your body is becoming now, and let that heaviness carry you deeper as we go. You might wonder why. Why would a sisterhood of such discipline, such patience, such careful thought, spend generations planting stories in the minds of distant strangers who could offer them nothing in return, who might never even be visited again? The answer is simple, and it is cold, and it is also, in its own way, a kind of terrible wisdom. It was a survival tool, a thing set in place and then left to wait, the way one might bury a supply of water in the desert against a thirst not yet felt. Imagine a single sister, far from home, cut off from the order, stranded on one of those hard and distant worlds among a people who did not know her and had no reason to trust her. In another life she might have been killed, or driven out, or left to die in the cold. But if that world had been seeded, long ago, by the Missionaria Protectiva, then she carried a key that fit a lock buried deep in the culture around her. She could speak the words of the old prophecy. She could present herself as the awaited one, or she could present her son as the promised child, the foretold figure come at last, and the people, holding their inherited faith, would recognize the signs they had been taught to look for. They would shelter her, they would feed her, they would protect her, and follow her, and obey. A kit of manufactured faith, buried in a living culture, waiting quietly across the generations for the day it might be needed. That is what the Missionaria Protectiva made. Not one such kit, but many, scattered like hidden caches across the reach of the empire, each one a little door the sisterhood could open if ever they found themselves in the dark. Let yourself breathe slowly here, and let the strangeness of it settle gently over you, the way a blanket settles, without any need to resolve it. For there is something unsettling in this work, and it is worth touching, softly, before we move on. The Missionaria Protectiva did not deal in mere trickery, in cheap illusions that fooled the eye for a moment. It dealt in genuine faith. The devotion it planted was real. The people who inherited these prophecies truly believed. They loved their sacred stories. They wept at them, and prayed to them, and passed them down to their children as the most precious things they owned. The shape of their hope, the promise that their suffering meant something and would one day end, and all the while, at the root of that hope, lay a thing that had been placed there deliberately, coolly, by an order that regarded religion not as a truth to be revered, but as a tool to be used. There is cynicism in that, and it is hard to look at directly. To take the deepest trust a people can offer, their reaching toward the sacred, and to shape it in advance so that it might one day serve your purpose, is a strange and heavy thing to do. And yet the sisterhood did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as long. They saw across centuries where others saw across years. They believed that everything, even faith, even hope, could be understood and guided and put to use in the service of survival. Human survival, the survival of the delicate thread of civilization they had appointed themselves to guard. And so, they treated the sacred as they treated everything, as material to be shaped. Cynicism and long wisdom, braided together so tightly that even they could not always tell the two apart. Let that thought grow soft now, and let your shoulders loosen, and your jaw and the small muscles around your eyes. Now let me bring you to the one example that matters most, the one that would, in time, undo them all. And I will tell it slowly, because it is the heart of this whole long story. There was a world called Arrakis, a desert world, the harshest and driest in all the empire, a place of endless dunes and burning sky, and nights so cold they cut. Water there was more precious than any jewel, so precious that the people saved even the moisture of their own breath, even the tears they were too disciplined to weep. And upon that world lived a people who had made themselves as hard and as enduring as the land itself. The Fremen. The free men of the desert, tough and secret and fierce, who moved across the sand like ghosts and knew its every mood, and who dreamed, in the deep places of their hearts, of a day when their terrible dry world might be made green. Long ago, long before the events of our story, the Missionaria Protectiva had come, in its quiet way, to Arrakis, and into the Fremen, into that hard and faithful people, the sisterhood had planted a prophecy. It was among the most beautiful and the most dangerous of all the seeds they ever sowed. They planted the legend of the Lisan al-Gaib. The words meant the voice from the outer world, and the shape of the legend was this. One day there would come a Messiah, not born of the desert, but come from off-world, from beyond the sky. He would be born of a Bene Gesserit mother, though the Fremen would not know to call it that. He would carry powers beyond the ordinary, and he would lead the Fremen out of their bondage and their thirst into freedom, and he would change the very face of their world and turn the desert green at last. A voice from the outer world, come to make the dream true. Feel, if you can, how perfectly that legend was shaped to the Fremen heart. It promised them exactly what they most longed for: freedom, water, a green land, a leader who would understand them and lift them up. And it was fitted, quietly, with the very markers the sisterhood might one day need: a mother of the order, a child of destiny, so that if ever a sister came to Arrakis in her hour of need, the lock and the key would find each other. And here is the part to hold gently as you drift. For generations upon generations, the Fremen held this prophecy as sacred truth. They did not know it had been placed among them. They did not know a hand from far away had shaped their most cherished hope. To them, the legend of the Lisan al-Gaib was as real and as old and as holy as the stars, a thing woven into the marrow of their people, believed with the whole of their fierce and faithful hearts. They waited for their Messiah across the long, dry centuries, watching the sky, keeping the faith, never dreaming that their waiting had been designed. And so the prophecy lay there among them, in the deep sand of their culture, like something loaded and waiting. A weapon, though none of them knew it was a weapon, a door standing ready to be opened, though none of them knew who had built it, or why, or what might one day come walking through. Let your breath grow slow and even now, and let this last thought carry you toward sleep. For the sisterhood, in all their long wisdom, had made one quiet error, though they would not learn of it for a great while yet. They believed they could plant belief the way they planted bloodlines, carefully, precisely, and keep it always within their control, a tool to be drawn out and set down again at will. But faith is not so obedient a thing. Faith, once it takes root in a people and grows for centuries in the dark, becomes its own force, with its own hunger, its own terrible momentum, and a prophecy that has waited that long, watered by generations of hope, does not always wake up gently. One day, though not yet, a mother and her son would come to Arrakis. She would be of the Bene Gesserit, trained in all their arts, and he would be a boy shaped by their long breeding program, though he was more than even they intended, and the two of them would walk, half by design and half by desperation, straight into the ancient prophecy the sisterhood had planted so long before. They would speak the old words, they would fit the waiting shape, and the belief of the Fremen held down and folded up for all those centuries, would blaze up around them like a fire in dry grass, far beyond the sisterhood's reach, far beyond anyone's control, and it would remake the empire and break the very order that had lit the first small spark. But that is a story for later, and you need not carry it into sleep with you tonight. Only let it rest, gently, at the edge of your mind. So this was the second great long game of the sisterhood. Not only the shaping of blood across the generations, but the shaping of belief, the quiet and audacious conviction that they could engineer not merely who was born, but what whole peoples held sacred in their hearts. It was a breathtaking ambition, and a dangerous one, for those who play with faith are playing with the deepest fire that human beings carry, a fire that warms and shelters, but can also, in an instant, leap its bounds and consume everything around it. And yet, for all its danger, this play with faith was only one hand of the sisterhood's reach. For while the Missionaria Protectiva worked far out among the primitive worlds, planting its patient seeds in the hearts of distant peoples, the Bene Gesserit were also at work much closer to the throne. They had learned, across their long centuries, that hope planted in the poor and the faithful was a fine and useful thing, but that power planted in the halls of the mighty was finer still. And so, quietly, patiently, in the way of all their works, they had begun to wind themselves into the very architecture of the empire, into its courts and its councils and its greatest houses, until there was scarcely a seat of power in all the human worlds that did not have, somewhere near it, a woman in a dark robe, watching, listening, and gently guiding the course of things. The chamber where the child slept was ordered differently now. They did not seek to sit upon the throne. That was the first thing to understand about the sisterhood, the thing that made them so difficult to see, so easy to overlook, so impossible to stop. They did not want the crown. A crown is a bright thing, a loud thing, a target for every ambitious hand and every sharpened knife. A crown draws the eye, and the sisterhood had learned across long centuries that the eye is drawn to power, and where the eye goes, the blade soon follows. So they did not reach for the crown. They reached instead for the hand that wore it, and the ear that listened beside it, and the bed in which its wearer slept, and the cradle in which its heir first opened its eyes. They did not want to rule. They wanted to be beside those who ruled, close enough to lean in, close enough to whisper, close enough that no one ever quite noticed they were there at all. And so, across the long, slow reach of the empire, in nearly every court that mattered, at the shoulder of nearly every man who held power, there stood a woman of the Bene Gesserit. You might have walked those halls of state and never marked her. She was not the loudest voice in the room. She was rarely the one who spoke first, or spoke most, or reached for the seat nearest the fire. She stood a little back, a little to the side, calm and watchful, her hands folded, her face composed into that gentle stillness the sisterhood taught its daughters from the cradle. She said little. She missed nothing. And when the great men of the empire made their great decisions, believing themselves the authors of their own choices, believing the thought that moved them had risen wholly from within their own minds, so often that thought had been placed there, softly, patiently, weeks or months before, by the quiet woman who stood a little to the side and said so little and missed so much. This was the shape of their power, and it is a gentle thing to consider as you lie there in the dark. Imagine influence that never announces itself. Imagine a hand that guides so lightly you never feel it upon you, only the sense that you have chosen well, that you have thought clearly, that the path you walk is the path you yourself decided to take. That was the art the sisterhood had perfected over generations upon generations. Not command, for command breeds resentment, and the commanded always know who commands them. Not force, for force breeds fear, and the fearful eventually rise. No. What they practiced was something far quieter and far deeper than either. They practiced the slow shaping of the mind, the tending of a decision the way a patient gardener tends a slow-growing tree, bending it a little here, pruning it a little there, over seasons and years, until at last it grew in exactly the direction they had always intended, and everyone who looked upon it believed it had grown that way of its own accord. They placed their sisters everywhere. This was the strategy, patient and vast, and it had been unfolding for so long that no one living could remember a time before it. A daughter of the Bene Gesserit might be given to a great house as a wife, joined in marriage to some duke or count or baron, taking her place at his side, ordering his household, bearing his children, and all the while remaining in the deepest chamber of her heart, a daughter of the sisterhood first. Another might come to a house as a concubine, bound not by contract, but by affection, and often more trusted for it, closer to the man than any wife of state arrangement could ever be. Another might serve as a trusted advisor, a counselor whose wisdom was sought on every matter of consequence, whose calm judgment the lord of the house had come to lean upon so heavily that he could no longer imagine deciding anything of weight without first hearing what she thought. And another, quieter still, might simply be a mother, raising the heir of a great line, shaping the child who would one day hold that power, teaching him, forming him, tending the soil of his young mind long before he ever suspected there was any shaping being done at all. Think of that for a moment, softly, as the warmth settles into you. The education of an heir. There is no more patient work in all the world, and no more powerful. A child does not choose what he is taught. He does not choose the stories poured into him before he can question them, the values pressed gently into him before he knows there are other values, the habits of thought worn into him like a path worn into grass by feet that pass the same way each day. And who tended that path, in house after house across the empire? So often, a sister. She chose the tutors. She chose the lessons. She chose which stories the boy heard at night, and which he never heard at all. She shaped how he thought about loyalty, about honor, about power, about the other great houses, and about the throne above them all. And when that boy grew into a man and took up his father's seat and began to make the decisions that would move armies and shift the fate of worlds, the shape of his thinking had already been set, long ago, by hands he never saw, in service of a design he never knew existed. This was how they steered history. Not from the throne, but from beside it. Not with proclamations, but with whispers. A word offered at the right moment, in the right ear, when the mind was open and the heart was quiet. A question asked so gently it seemed like idle wondering, yet planted a doubt that would grow. A silence held at just the right instant, so that a man rushing toward a foolish choice felt, in that silence, the faint cold breath of his own uncertainty, and paused, and reconsidered, and chose otherwise, and believed the reconsidering was his own wisdom. They read the truth of every negotiation, these sisters, for they had been trained to read the body the way a scholar reads a page. They saw the flicker in the eye that betrayed the lie, the catch in the breath that betrayed the fear, the tightening at the corner of the mouth that betrayed the thing a man most wished to hide. Nothing said in their presence was fully hidden from them. And so when the ambassadors came, and the treaties were argued, and the fates of houses hung upon who could be believed, it was so often the quiet sister at the Lord's shoulder who knew, before he knew, which man across the table was telling the truth and which was not. And you might wonder, lying there, how could all of this go unnoticed? How could a whole order of women thread themselves through the courts of an empire and never be seen for what they were? But that was the deepest art of all. They were seen. They were simply never seen clearly. A wife is expected. A mother is expected. A wise counselor at a great lord's side is expected, and welcomed, and thanked. Each sister, taken alone, was only what she appeared to be, only a woman doing the ordinary work that women had always done in the halls of the powerful. It was only if you could have risen high above the whole empire, high enough to see every court at once, every house, every cradle. Every quiet woman standing a little to the side and drawn a line from each of them back to the sisterhood that ordered them all. Only then would the true shape have appeared. A web, vast and fine and nearly invisible, its threads reaching into every seat of power in the known worlds, and every thread running back, at last, to the same patient hands. And at the very summit of that web, at the highest court of all, they had placed their own beside the golden lion throne itself. For even the emperor, the Padishah emperor who ruled over all the great houses and all the known worlds, even he had a Bene Gesserit at his side. She was called his truth-sayer. She was a reverend mother of the sisterhood, one of the highest and most disciplined of their order, and her task at court was to listen. When men came before the emperor to speak, to petition, to swear their loyalty, or plead their case, or offer their carefully worded assurances, she stood near, still and silent, and she listened not only to the words, but to everything beneath the words. And afterward, when the speakers had gone, she would tell the emperor quietly what was true and what was not, who had lied to him, who had feared him, who had hidden a knife behind a smile. She was his safeguard against deception, his ear that could not be fooled, his shield against the endless lies that surround any throne. He trusted her, as an emperor must trust the one who tells him truth. And here is the gentle irony, the thing to turn over slowly in the quiet of your mind. The one he trusted to guard him against deception was herself the instrument of the deepest deception of all. For the truth-sayer served the emperor, yes, but she served the sisterhood first, always first, and behind first. The Reverend Mother who stood beside the golden lion throne, the one they had placed there to be their ear and their voice at the very heart of imperial power, was a woman named Gaius Helen Mohiam. She was old in the ways of the order, hard as tempered steel beneath her stillness, and she was among the great movers of the sisterhood's long designs. She heard what the emperor heard. She saw what passed at the summit of the empire, and what she learned there, and what she quietly guided there, flowed back into the vast slow currents of the sisterhood's plans, the plans that reached across centuries, the plans that no single lifetime could hold in view. The emperor believed she guarded his truth, and she did. But the truth she served most faithfully was one he would never be told. Yet do not think this power came without a price, for it did. And the price was paid in the deepest and most private places of the heart. Consider what it meant to be one of these sisters given to the courts of the empire. A daughter of the Bene Gesserit did not choose the man she was sent to. She did not fall in love and follow her heart to some chosen door. she was placed. The order looked upon its long designs, its breeding charts, its patient calculations reaching down through the generations, and it decided where each sister would go, and to whom, and for what purpose. And she went. She was given to a man she had never met, in service of a plan she may only have half understood, and she made her life beside him, and often she bore his children, not out of the wanting of her own heart, but out of the ordering of the sisterhood. Children conceived to a purpose. Children brought into the world to carry a certain bloodline forward, to join one great lineage to another, to be the next patient step in a design that had been walking forward, one careful generation at a time, for thousands of years. Think how quiet that loneliness must have been. To stand at the center of power and yet belong to no one and to nothing save the distant order that had sent you there. To lie beside a man each night and hold always a locked room within yourself that he could never enter. A place where your true loyalty lived, hidden from the one closest to you in all the world. To look upon your own children knowing they were, in some measure, not entirely your own, but pieces upon a board far larger than your love for them. The sisterhood asked this of its daughters, and its daughters gave it, because they had been taught from their earliest years that the order came first. Before comfort, before happiness, before love, before the self. Loyalty to the sisterhood above all things, woven so deep into them that most never thought to question it, and those who did question it questioned it alone, in silence, in the dark, where no one could hear. This was the coldness beneath the power. This was the price. A whole life spent as a piece in someone else's design, moved here and there across the great slow board of history, and never, not once, permitted to simply belong to itself. And it is here, in this cold and patient machinery, that we must turn our gaze toward a single one of them. For among all the sisters placed in all the courts of the empire, there was one whose story was about to become the hinge upon which everything would turn. Her name was Jessica. She had been trained in the ways of the order as all of them were, disciplined, watchful, schooled in the deep control of body and mind, and she had been placed, as so many were, beside a powerful man. She was bound to Duke Leto Atreides, the lord of a proud and ancient house, a man of honor and warmth, and she was his concubine, his beloved, the mother of his line, and the sisterhood, looking upon its charts and its long designs, had given her an instruction, clear and simple, a single quiet order in the great web of orders that governed every sister's life. She was to bear the Duke a daughter, only a daughter. For the daughter mattered to the plan. The daughter was a needed step, a particular thread in the pattern the sisterhood had been weaving toward across the centuries, and Jessica's part in that pattern was to bring a girl child into the world, a daughter of the Atreides line, who would then be joined, in the fullness of the design, to another bloodline the order had long been cultivating, so that the threads might draw together at last toward the end the sisterhood had sought for so many patient generations. That was her task. That was all that was asked of her. A daughter, and no more. But Jessica had done something the sisterhood, for all its wisdom, for all its reading of the human heart, had not fully reckoned upon. She had fallen in love. Truly, deeply, wholly, she had come to love her Duke, not as an assignment, not as a piece placed beside another piece, but as a woman loves a man, with her whole heart and her whole self. And love, you see, is the one force the sisterhood could measure and study and even use, but never quite command. And in that love, something began to move in Jessica that all her long training had not silenced. A wish. A wish that belonged to her and to Leto and to no order and no design. The wish to give the man she loved the thing his heart most wanted, the thing every proud lord of an ancient house longs for above all else. A son, an heir, a boy to carry his name. And so, lying there in the warm dark, you may feel the great slow machine of the sisterhood, turning as it had turned for 1,000 years, patient and cold and sure, beginning in one small quiet place to catch. For all their courts and all their whispers, for all their sisters placed at every throne, for all their careful centuries of design, they had built their vast web upon the hearts of women, and now one of those hearts was about to choose for itself. The plan had reached across 10,000 years to arrive at this single woman, in this single house, with this single quiet order, bear only a daughter. And this single woman, in the deepest silence of her own heart, in a love no chart had counted on and no discipline had smothered, was drawing near to the moment when she would decide, alone, to disobey. And in that decision, though none of them yet knew it, though even Jessica could not yet see the whole of what it would unleash, the 1,000-year design of the Bene Gesserit began, ever so gently, to slip from their hands. The plan the sisterhood had laid for Jessica was, on its surface, a simple thing. The way that all their most delicate designs were made to seem simple. She was to go to Duke Leto Atreides, and she was to become his bound concubine, and she was to give him a child. But not just any child. The order that had come down to her, carried in the quiet voice of her teachers and sealed with the weight of 1,000 years, was very precise. She was to bear a daughter, an Atreides daughter. And that was all. That was the whole of what the plan required of her body and her love and her life. A single girl, born of the noble blood of House Atreides. You may wonder why a daughter mattered so much, when to the great houses of the Imperium it was so often sons who were counted and cherished and sent to war. But the sisterhood did not think as the great houses thought. They did not care for names or titles or who would sit upon a throne. They cared for blood, and for the slow braiding of blood across the centuries, and in their long ledgers a daughter was a bridge. This daughter, Jessica's daughter, was meant to be a bridge across the oldest and bitterest chasm in the whole of the human family. She was meant to be wed, when she was grown, to a young man of House Harkonnen, to a Harkonnen heir. And with that marriage the ancient feud between the Atreides and the Harkonnens, that long hatred of blade and betrayal that had poisoned so many generations, would at last be quieted and closed. The two enemy lines would flow together into one, and from that union, in the very next generation, would come the child the sisterhood had waited for since the beginning. The Kwisatz Haderach, born of reconciled enemies, born of two rivers of noble blood joined at last, and born above all under the sisterhood's careful and loving hand. Their superbeing, their bridge, made by them, held by them, obedient to them. That was the plan. Rest a moment with how beautiful it was, in its cold and patient way. 1,000 years of quiet arrangement, of marriages nudged and pairings whispered, and lines gathered like threads, all of it narrowing now to a single point, to a single woman lying beside the man she had been given to, holding in her own body the power to make or unmake the final move. Everything the sisterhood had ever done came down to Jessica, to what she would choose to grow inside herself, to a daughter. And Jessica loved him. That is where the plan broke. Not in a battle, not in a betrayal, not in some clash of great powers with fleets and armies, but in something so small and so human that the sisterhood, for all their wisdom, had never learned how to weigh it. Jessica loved Duke Leto Atreides. She had been sent to him as an instrument, a tool of the Bene Gesserit, trained never to love, warned again and again against exactly this softness. And she loved him anyway. She loved his gravity and his gentleness, the way he carried the sorrows of his house, the way he looked at her not as a possession, but as a partner of his heart, and she knew what he longed for. She knew that this proud, careful, weary man wanted, more than titles or victories, a son. An heir of his own blood to carry the Atreides name forward, to inherit the signet ring, to stand where he had stood. He wanted a son. And she, who could give him one, wanted to give it to him. You must understand that this was no accident of nature. A Bene Gesserit had command over her own body far beyond anything the ordinary human ever dreamed. She could read the workings of her own flesh, could shift its balances, could even choose, at the moment of conception, whether the child she carried would be a son or a daughter. This was one of the sisterhood's own secret powers, taught to her by the sisterhood, honed in the sisterhood's schools. And Jessica turned that power, that gift given to her, to serve the plan, and she used it against the plan. For love, she chose to bear a son. She looked at the 1,000 years of design that ran through her, and she looked at the man she loved and the sorrow she could ease, and she chose the son. And so Paul was born, Paul Atreides, a boy where the sisterhood had commanded a girl. Let that settle over you gently, the sheer weight of it, the quiet enormity of what one woman did in a single act of tenderness. 1,000 years, 90 generations of patient breeding, of matches made and lines guided, of women giving their bodies and their children and their whole lives to a design none of them would live to see completed. All of it, that vast slow architecture of the ages, undone, not shattered by a rival power, not outfought or outwitted, but simply set aside by love. By a mother who wanted to give the man she loved the son he ached for. The gardeners had planned every branch and every graft with infinite care, and one of their own gardeners had reached out and grown something they never asked for, because her heart told her to. There is something almost unbearably soft in that, and something vast, and you can hold both of those feelings at once as you drift here in the quiet. But the breaking of the plan was only the beginning of what Jessica had set loose. For the son she bore was not merely the wrong child in the wrong place. Paul was the culmination itself. Come too soon. All those centuries of gathering had been meant to bring the Kwisatz Haderach into being one generation later, out of the joined Atreides and Harkonnen lines. And yet the blood had run so true, the design had come so close to its ripening, that the superb being they sought appeared anyway, a generation early, in this boy. He carried the potential the sisterhood had hunted through all of history, but he carried it born of the wrong pairing, on the wrong branch, before the appointed hour. And most dangerous of all, most frightening of all to those who had spent 1,000 years planning, he was not theirs. He had not been made under their control. There was no leash upon him, no long conditioning threaded through the women who had shaped his line to make him gentle to the sisterhood's hand. He was simply loose in the world, a thing of terrible potential with no keeper. And then Jessica did the second thing, the thing that turned the wrong child into a danger past all reckoning. She trained him. As Paul grew, his mother taught him. She gave him the sisterhood's own secret ways, the disciplines that had always been kept to women alone. She taught him the voice, that trick of the throat, and the will that could bend another person to obey with a single spoken command. She taught him the deep observation, the reading of the smallest tremor in a face or a hand. She taught him the control of the body, the prana and bindu, the mastery of muscle and nerve and breath. She poured the Bene Gesserit way into her son, and so a man came to hold the secret weapons of the sisterhood, the powers they had guarded across the centuries as their own private strength. A man wielding what had only ever belonged to the women of the order. You can feel how the danger has doubled and doubled again. How what began as a small act of love has grown, quietly, into something the whole sisterhood would come to fear. They did fear it. There came a day, when Paul was still a boy, that one of the sisterhood's greatest came to test him. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, old and sharp and heavy with the authority of her order. The very woman who had trained Jessica and given her the order she disobeyed. She came to look at this child who should never have been born a son, and she brought with her the oldest and cruelest of tests. She brought the Gamjabar, the needle tipped with a death that waits at the neck, and beside it a box that held only pain. She made the boy put his hand into the box, and she held the poisoned needle at his throat, and she told him that if he drew his hand out from the pain he would die upon the needle. It was the test of a human being, the test of whether a creature could master its own animal terror, could hold still against agony because the mind ruled the flesh, could be, in the sisterhood's cold and ancient measure, truly human and not merely beast. And the boy passed. He held his hand in the fire of that box past any point she had expected, past what she thought a child could bear, and he did not flinch away. And he lived, and Mohiam, drawing back the needle, looked at him with something that was not triumph. It was closer to dread. For she had felt, in the strength of him, in the depth of what he could endure, the shape of the thing they had made and had not meant to make. Here was the potential they had bred toward for 1,000 years, sitting before her in a boy who was not under their control, whose mother had already broken faith, whose blood had come early and wrong. She spoke of it as a thing they had meddled with beyond their power to hold, a force loosed that they could not now call back. They had reached, across all those centuries, for a god they might keep on a leash. And they had made instead a wild thing, and it was too late to unmake it. And the old woman knew it as she looked into the boy's eyes. You know, resting here in the dark, where the story went next. It went to Arrakis. It went to the desert planet, to the dunes and the spice and the great worms and the blue-eyed people of the sand. And it was there that the two halves of the sisterhood's long labor came together and blazed up in a single man. For remember the other thing the sisterhood had done across the centuries, the seeding of religion, the Missionaria Protectiva, the sowing of prophecy and myth on world after world so that a sister in danger might always find shelter in a belief already waiting. On Arrakis they had sown one such prophecy long ago, deep among the Fremen of the desert. A promise of a voice from the outer world, a Lisan al-Ghib, a Messiah who would come to them from another sky and lead them to paradise, to a green and gentle world made from the sand. It was a lie planted for protection, a story with no truth beneath it, a tool. And Paul stepped into it. When his father's house was betrayed and destroyed, and he fled with his mother into the deep desert, into the arms of the Fremen, he came to them as a stranger from another world, gifted with strange powers, walking already inside the shape of their ancient promise. and the prophecy the sisterhood had seated closed around him like a hand. The Fremen looked at the young man with the powers of the voice and the sight and the mastery, and they saw the one they had been told to wait for, the Messiah from beyond. And here is the terrible meeting, the collision at the heart of the whole long story. The sisterhood's two greatest instruments, the two vast works of their 1,000 years, the breeding program that had bent blood toward a superbeing, and the seeded religion that had planted a waiting Messiah among the desert people, these two great engines, built separately, meant to serve the order from the shadows, came crashing together in one single man. The bred superbeing walked straight into the seeded prophecy. The Kwisatz Haderach became the Lisan al-Gaib. And both of them, both the bloodline and the belief, ignited at once inside a man who belonged to the sisterhood not at all. So Paul became the very thing they had dreamed of across all of history, the superbeing, the bridge across space and time, the mind that could look where no Reverend Mother could look, into the place in the self that was too terrible for any of them to face. Everything they had wanted, he became. But he became it as his own master. Not as their creature, not as their obedient instrument held gently on the leash of 1,000 years of conditioning, but as a free man. His own will, his only ruler. And with the desert people gathered to him as their promised one, with the myth the sisterhood had planted now burning as a living fire in the hearts of a whole warrior people, he rose. He rose past the great houses and past the emperor himself, and he loosed upon the human universe a holy war, a jihad in his name, that swept from world to world with a fury the sisterhood had never wanted and could not stop. Billions would die beneath his green banner. The gardeners, who had labored so long and so patiently to grow one perfect and obedient flower, had grown instead a thing that tore the garden apart, and there was nothing at all they could do but watch it spread. And in that watching lies the bitter heart of the whole matter, the lesson folded quietly into the ruin. For where had the sisterhood gone wrong? Not in their patience, which was vast, and not in their wisdom, which was deep, and not in their power, which was real. They had gone wrong in their pride, in the great and quiet hubris of believing that they could plan everything, and control everything, and hold everything in their hands across 1,000 years without a single thing slipping loose. They had believed they could arrange the very blood of humanity like pieces on a board. They had believed they could plant a Messiah and keep him, could breed a God and leash him, could design the future down to the last child and have it obey. And the future was undone by the two things their long cold wisdom had discounted, the two things they had never learned to weigh. The love of a mother who chose a son for the man she loved, and the free will of the one they had made, who, once born, belonged to no one but himself. Those were the small human things they had left out of their calculations, and those small human things broke the 1,000-year plan as easily as a hand parts still water. There is a gentleness even in that hard lesson, something you can carry down with you toward sleep. That for all their reaching, the sisterhood could not command love, and could not command a soul, and perhaps no one ever truly can. The things that break the greatest plans are so often the tenderest things. A mother's wish, a free heart. And so the sisterhood, who had guided the human race from the shadows for 100 generations, now found themselves standing in the shadow of a man they had helped to make, but could not hold, watching the age of Paul rise up over the whole of the Imperium like a new and blinding sun. And the question that remained for them, the quiet question they now had to answer, was how the great and ancient sisterhood would go on living in a universe that no longer belonged to them, in the age of an emperor and messiah entirely beyond their control. And so you come now to the last turning of this long story, to the place where all the sisterhood's patient centuries seemed to fold in upon themselves, and where a plan older than memory arrived at last at the one thing it had always wanted, and found, in the wanting fulfilled, only sorrow. Rest here with me a while, in the quiet after the great work. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift as gently as sand settling after the wind has passed. There is nothing left for you to do now, but listen, and let the ending come softly. For all those thousands of years the Bene Gesserit had labored toward a single hope. Through all the careful matings, the whispered marriages arranged across the width of the empire, the daughters commanded where the sisterhood needed daughters, and the sons woven quietly into the lengthening chain, they had reached toward one figure at the end of the pattern. The Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could be many places at once. The male Bene Gesserit, whose mind could bridge the space that the sisters could not cross, who could look into the dark places their own inner sight could never reach, and see. He was to be theirs. That was the whole meaning of it. He was to be the fruit of their orchard, grown in their soil, held in their hands, a thing they had made, and therefore a thing they would guide. He was to be the final proof that the sisterhood could shape even the deepest destiny of the human race, that nothing, not even the coming of a superhuman, lay beyond the reach of their long design. And then he came. But he came a generation too soon, and he came outside their grasp, and he came in fire. Feel, for a moment, the strange shape of that. Everything they wanted, arriving exactly as they had dreamed it would arrive, and yet arriving wrong. Paul Atreides was the flowering of their bloodline. In his veins ran the careful centuries of their breeding. He was the answer to the oldest question the sisterhood had ever asked, and he was born of a woman who had disobeyed them, raised on a world they had not chosen, awakened by a spice they did not control, and lifted to the throne of the known universe by armies that answered to him and to no one else. The prize was real. The prize was everything they had said it would be. But the prize was not in their hands. It had walked out of their orchard and taken a crown, and it looked back at them now, with eyes that saw further than their own. Let yourself sit with the ache of that, gently, the way you might sit with an old regret at the edge of sleep. Imagine the Reverend Mothers in their quiet rooms when the news came that a Kwisatz Haderach ruled the empire and was not theirs. There was no triumph in it. There was only a kind of cold dismay, the dismay of the gardener who watches the one perfect bloom she has waited a lifetime to see open in a garden she can no longer enter. They had bred him to be a bridge they could walk across. Instead, he had become a power they could only stand beneath and look up at and fear. And they did fear him. Understand that. These were women who feared very little, who had trained themselves across a lifetime to master terror, to let it pass through them and leave nothing behind. They feared him because he could do the one thing they had never been able to do. He could look where they were blind. In the deepest reaches of their inner ceremonies, where a Reverend Mother turned her sight inward and searched the long dark corridor of all the mothers who had come before her, there was always a place she could not go, a presence that made her flinch away, a shadow no sister could face. Paul could face it. Paul could stand in that place and open his eyes. And a creature who could see what they could not see, who could stand where they could not stand, was a creature they could not deceive, could not maneuver, could not fold back into the pattern. For an order whose whole strength was secret knowledge and quiet control, there was no fear deeper than this, to stand before someone who knew more than they did. So the prize was lost in the very moment of its winning. The bloodline they had tended for 80 generations had produced its miracle and then slipped free. And here, at the lowest point of their long story, you might expect them to break. You might expect despair, or surrender, or the slow, quiet fading of an order that had reached for the ultimate and closed its hand on empty air. But that is not what the Bene Gesserit did. That is never what the Bene Gesserit did. They did the thing they had always done, the thing they had done through every reversal in all their thousands of years. They adapted. They waited. They began, quietly, patiently, to plot. Let that settle over you like a warm weight, the strange constancy of them. Empires had risen and fallen while the sisterhood watched. Great houses had climbed to glory and been ground back into dust while the sisterhood watched. Wars had swept across the stars, and rulers had been crowned and murdered, and whole worlds had changed hands, and through all of it the sisters in their black robes had endured, patient, secret, playing a game so long that no single defeat could ever truly end it. A setback that would have destroyed any other power was, to them, merely one more turn in a game measured not in years but in centuries. They had lost the prize. Very well. Then they would set about, calmly, with all their old cold skill, to recover it. For the bloodline was not gone. That was the thing they held to. Paul lived, and Paul carried in himself the precious inheritance they had spent so long assembling. And Paul was a man, and men die, and dynasties turn. And where there was that bloodline, there was still the chance to reach it, to draw it back, to secure it for the designs of the future. The Kwisatz Haderach they could not command, but the genes that had made him, the priceless pattern folded into his flesh, that they might still recover, if they were patient enough, if they were clever enough, if they waited long enough and schemed well enough. And they were the most patient, the most clever, the most enduring schemers the human race had ever produced. So in the years of Paul's empire, in the strange, bright, terrible age, when a boy from Caledon sat as emperor and messiah over a religion that burned across the galaxy in his name, the sisterhood did not stand aside. They moved back into the shadows where they had always been most at home, and there, in the quiet, they began to weave. They were not alone in their unease. There were others in that age who looked at the young God on his throne and feared what he had become, who wanted the balance of power tilted back toward the old ways, who dreamed of a universe they could once again predict. The Spacing Guild, whose navigators folded space by the grace of the spice, and who saw in their own limited prescience a future clouded by this man who saw so much further than they. The Tlilaxu, the strange gene shapers of Tlilax, masters of the flesh and its secret arts, who could grow a man anew from the cells of the dead, and who traded in temptations subtle enough to snare even the wary, and the sisterhood, still aching for their lost prize, still hungry for the bloodline, still certain that the human race would be safest in the end if its deepest destiny were guided by their hands and not left to the whims of a single unmanageable god. Into that gathering, current the Bene Gesserit lent their old skills. A conspiracy took shape, quiet and patient and many-layered, aimed at the emperor on his throne. I will not lay every thread of it before you, and I will not tell you how it all turned, for that is a story that unwinds slowly and belongs to another night. Let it be enough here to feel the shape of it, that the sisterhood, having lost, did not stop, that they joined with the guild and the Tleilaxo, and moved against the very power they themselves had bred, not out of simple hatred, but out of that same ancient purpose that had driven them from the beginning. They wanted the bloodline. They wanted control. They wanted the human future back in their careful keeping. And so they schemed against the Kwisatz Haderach exactly as they had once schemed to create him, with the same cool patience, the same long sight, the same conviction that they alone could be trusted to steer the species safely through the dark. Whether they were right to trust themselves so, you may decide for yourself, softly or not at all. There is no need to decide tonight, but rest for a moment in the deeper truth beneath all their scheming, the truth that outlasts any single plot. Because this is the thing to understand about the Bene Gesserit, the thing that makes them what they are. They do not measure victory the way ordinary powers measure it. An emperor counts his triumphs in the span of his reign. A house counts its glory in the lifetimes of its lords, but the sisterhood counts in ages. And by the measure of ages, no defeat is final, and no throne is permanent, and no God endures. Paul would rise, and Paul would rule, and Paul in his time would pass, as all things pass. His dynasty would follow him, and it too, in the long turning of the centuries, would have its rise, and its shadow, and its end. And through all of it, quietly, in their libraries and their schools and their hidden chapters, the sisters in black would remain. Watching, waiting, recording, weaving, playing the longest game of all. Hold that thought as gently as you would hold a candle in a still room. Empires rise and fall, and the sisterhood remains. A god-emperor is crowned and dies, and the sisterhood remains. Whole ages of the human story open and close like the slow breathing of some enormous sleeper, and still, in the quiet places between, the sisterhood remains. Patient, secret, tending their bloodlines, guarding their knowledge, guiding the species by their own cold and steady lights. They had reached for the Kwisatz Haderach and lost him, and it would have broken anyone else, and it did not break them. Because they were not playing for a single lifetime. They were playing for the survival of the human race across the darkness of all the time to come. And a game like that has no last move. It only goes on, and on, further into the future than any of them would ever live to see, the black-robed watchers still there in the shadows behind every throne, still weaving their patient designs long after Paul and all his line had faded into legend. There is something in that endurance to marvel at, and something in it to trouble you, and you may let both feelings rest side by side without choosing between them. For here, at the close, the old questions gather quietly around the sisterhood, and it is worth sitting with them a while as the darkness deepens. Think of the two kinds of power that this whole long story sets against each other. There is the power that sits upon a throne, that wears a crown and speaks in the open, and is seen by all, the power of Paul the Emperor, blazing and terrible and brief. And there is the other kind, the power that never shows its face, that works from behind the curtain, that shapes the world by whispers and marriages and patient centuries of unseen labor, the power of the sisterhood. One rules and is remembered, the other guides and is forgotten. And the story seems to ask, softly, which of these is truly the greater? The one who sits on the throne, or the ones who arranged, across 100 generations, that there should be someone to sit there at all. And think of patience, the strange, deep patience of those who think in centuries. What is it to love a goal so distant that you will die long before it is reached, and labor for it anyway, adding your single stone to a wall whose top you will never see? There is a kind of grandeur in that, a selflessness almost, a devotion to the far future of the whole human family that no ordinary heart could hold. And there is a kind of coldness in it too, for those who think in centuries can come to see the living people around them as merely the passing pieces of a longer game, to be moved and spent and set aside in service of a design that no single one of them will ever be told. And think, most of all, of the danger that runs beneath the whole vast enterprise, the danger of believing that everything can be planned. For that was the sisterhood's oldest faith and their oldest pride, that with enough patience and enough knowledge and enough control, even destiny itself could be shaped to a design. Even the deepest currents of the species could be steered. Even the coming of a superhuman could be arranged, generation by careful generation, like the breeding of a garden. And their whole story is, in a way, the answer that the universe gave to that pride. For at the very end, when the plan at last bore its fruit, the fruit came wrong, and early, and free. Love had slipped into the pattern where love was not commanded. A mother had chosen a son for her own heart's reasons, and unmade an order's careful arithmetic. And the miracle they had built the machine to produce had stepped out of the machine and looked back at them with eyes they could not meet. There is a lesson folded quietly into that about the hubris of those who believe they can control everything, even love, even destiny, even the wild, deep places of the human soul that no breeding chart can reach. And you need not name the lesson tonight. You need only feel it, resting there beneath the story, like a stone beneath still water. So here is the last gentle question, and you may leave it unanswered, for it was made to be left unanswered, and there is peace in that. Were they humanity's secret protectors, these patient women in their black robes, the quiet guardians who steered the species through danger after danger towards some safer shore that only they could see? Or were they humanity's secret puppeteers, cold hands upon the strings, moving the whole race through its long dance for purposes it was never allowed to know? Was the line between guiding and manipulating ever truly there at all? Or did it blur and vanish somewhere in the long dark corridor of the centuries until even the sisters themselves could no longer say on which side of it they stood? Protectors or puppeteers? Perhaps both. Perhaps there was never any difference. You do not have to decide. Let the question drift up like smoke and thin away into the dark, and let it go. For you know the whole of it now. You know the long story of the Bene Gesserit, from their beginnings in the ashes of the old wars, through their schools and their sisters and their secret arts, through the breeding program that reached across the stars and the millennia toward a single hoped-for figure at the end of time, through the woman who loved too well and the boy who saw too far, to this quiet close, where the prize was won and lost in the same breath, and the sisterhood, patient as ever, turned back to the shadows to begin again. The hidden hand behind the throne of Dune, the watchers who were always there, and always would be. You have followed them all the long way to the end, and now there is nothing more to hold. So let it go now. Let the whole vast story loosen its hold on you, chapter by chapter, thread by thread, until it is only a soft warmth somewhere at the back of your mind. And then, not even that, Let the sisters in their black robes fade back into the quiet from which they came, their endless patient watching growing dim and far away, no longer yours to keep. There is nothing left to do. There is nothing left to hold on to. The plan is finished, and the empire sleeps, and the desert stretches out silent beneath its cold and countless stars, the sand still warm from a sun long set, the wind moving slow across the dunes, carrying nothing now but the hush of the dark. Let it carry you too. Down past the throne and the schemes and the long centuries, down past the story and the questions and the last soft light, down into the deep and gentle quiet where the spice sleeps and the desert keeps its silence, and there is only the dark and the slow warm drift, and rest, and rest, and rest. And so we come to the quiet end of it, the whole long story of the sisterhood laid out behind us now, from their beginnings in the ashes of the machine wars, through their secret arts and their patient schools, through the 1,000-year plan and the seeded prophecies and the hidden hand in every court, all the way to the woman who loved too well and the boy who saw too far. And the prize won and lost in a single breath. You followed the shadow all the way to its end, and now you can let it go. You were never meant to carry it. Let the sisters in their black robes fade back into the quiet from which they came. Let their whispering fall silent. Let the great slow game they played across the centuries wind gently down to stillness, until it is only a soft warmth somewhere at the back of your mind, and then, not even that. There is no test in the morning. There is nothing you need to hold. The whole long story can drift off downstream now, and you can simply stay here, warm and safe, in the soft dark, resting. Let it all grow still. Let the courts and the thrones and the endless patient scheming fade to nothing, small and far away, as stars going out one by one at the edge of the night. There is nothing out there in all that vast and ancient design that needs anything from you now. There is nothing to decide, nothing to solve, nothing to be. There is only your breath, slow and easy, and the weight of your body sinking down, and the quiet closing softly over you like sand smoothing itself flat in the wind. You did something kind for yourself tonight, choosing to rest. I'm glad you spent this time here with me, among the shadows and the secrets and the patient watching women. If any small part of you is still awake enough to hear this, let my voice be the last of it now, going softer and softer, fading away like a figure slipping quietly out of a room, until the dark is gentle and complete. Sleep now, sleep deeply, and sleep well. The sisterhood will keep its secrets, and the desert will keep its silence, and everything can wait for morning. From all of us here at the Spice Sleeper, good night, and the sweetest of dreams. Rest well. I'll be right here whenever you need somewhere quiet to land again. Good night.